Okay, so here's something nobody ever says out loud. The worst episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants might actually be more interesting than some of the best ones. And I know, that sounds like the kind of take that gets you banned from every SpongeBob fan forum on the internet. But stay with me here, because I've spent the last few weeks doing something that I genuinely would not recommend to anyone, which is watching every single universally despised SpongeBob episode back to back, taking notes, rewinding scenes, cross-referencing fan wikis at 3 in the morning, and trying to understand something that I think most people skip right past. Not whether these episodes are bad. They are. Most of them are genuinely, almost impressively bad. But why they're bad? What broke? What specific decisions were made? By real human beings in a writer's room, that turned the most beloved animated show of the 21st century into something that made its own fans stop watching. Because here's the thing that nobody wants to sit with. The worst episodes of SpongeBob didn't come from nowhere. They came from the same show, the same characters, in some cases, the same writers. And understanding how a show goes from band geeks to one-course meal, from pizza delivery to a pal for Gary that tells you something not just about SpongeBob, but about what happens when a creative vision gets stretched past its breaking point. So tonight, we're going through all of it. Every infamous episode, every moment that made you recoil, every creative decision that makes you wonder if anyone at Nickelodeon was actually watching what they were putting on the air. And I'm going to tell you exactly what I think went wrong, episode by episode, scene by scene. If you're watching this late at night, get comfortable, because this one's going to take a while. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these for you. So hit that button and settle in. But before we get into the specific episodes, I need you to understand the context. Because the worst episodes of SpongeBob don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the shadow of something remarkable. SpongeBob SquarePants premiered on Nickelodeon on May 1st, 1999, as a sneak peek after the Kids' Choice Awards, with its official premiere following on July 17th of that year. And within its first month on air, it had already overtaken Pokémon as the highest-rated Saturday morning children's series. By the end of 2001, it was the most watched kids show on television. By May 2002, total viewership had reached over 61 million, 20 million of whom were between 18 and 49 years old. This was not a kids show that happened to have some adult fans. This was a cultural phenomenon that crossed every demographic boundary in American television. And the man behind it was Stephen Hillenburg. Born August 21st, 1961, in Lawton, Oklahoma. Raised in Anaheim, California. Marine biology educator at the Orange County Marine Institute, where he wrote an educational comic called The Intertidal Zone about tide pool animals. He enrolled at the California Institute of the Arts in 1989 to study experimental animation, worked on Rocko's Modern Life at Nickelodeon from 1993 to 1996, and then started developing the characters and concepts from the Intertidal Zone into what would become SpongeBob SquarePants. The show was initially going to be called SpongeBoy Ahoy, until they found out the name SpongeBoy was already copyrighted. It was already in use by another product. Hillenburg made sure to keep the word sponge in the name, so viewers wouldn't mistake the character for a block of cheese, and SquarePants was chosen as a family name because it referred to the character's square shape and had, as Hillenburg put it, a nice ring to it. And here's the thing about the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob that I think people forget when they're arguing about which later episodes are the worst. Those early seasons weren't just good, and they were operating on a level of comedic craftsmanship that animated television rarely achieves. The timing, the visual gags, the character dynamics, the way the show was constantly aware that it was set underwater without ever losing its comedic momentum. Every episode felt like it was made by people who cared about making each 11 minutes as dense and funny and weirdly moving as possible. SpongeBob in those early seasons was naive, but not stupid. Squidward was grumpy, but not heartless. Patrick was dim, but lovable. Mr. Krabs was cheap, but protective of his crew. Every character had edges, contradictions, humanity, or, sea creature anity. And then Stephen Hillenburg made a movie and wanted to stop. In 2002, then Hillenburg told the Los Angeles Times that he definitely needed a break. He halted production of the show to work on the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, which came out in 2004, and which he explicitly intended to be the series finale. The movie ends with SpongeBob being promoted to manager of the Krusty Krab 2. That's the ending. That's SpongeBob's arc, completed. Hillenburg even said in interviews that he wanted to stop so the show wouldn't jump the shark, and felt that 3 seasons, around 60 episodes, was a typical and appropriate run for an animated series. He compared it to the run of the Ren and Stimpy show. He said he thought it was good not to go to the point where people don't want to see your show anymore. Think about that for a second. The creator of SpongeBob SquarePants saw his own show clearly enough to know when it should end. He knew, but Nickelodeon didn't agree. As storyboard director Sam Henderson observed, the show was such a cash cow for the station that it couldn't afford not to keep making episodes. And Hillenburg initially doubted they'd continue without him. He said he thought the executives respect that my contribution is important, but they did continue. Paul Tibbitt took over as showrunner. Hillenburg stayed credited as executive producer, but stepped away from the day-to-day creative decisions that had defined the show's identity. And that's where our story really begins. Because what happened next? What happened in seasons 4 through 8? And particularly in seasons 6 and 7, is one of the most dramatic quality declines in the history of American animation. And I say that not to be mean. I say it because it's true, and because understanding the specific ways it happened tells us something important about what makes SpongeBob work when it works, and what goes catastrophically wrong when it doesn't. Now, I want to be fair. Season 4 is generally well regarded. It has some genuinely great episodes, and a lot of fans actually rank it alongside the first 3 seasons. Season 5 is more divisive, but still mostly solid. The real problems, the episodes we're going to spend most of tonight talking about, begin in earnest around the second half of Season 6, and run through Season 7 and into Season 8. This period, roughly 2008 through 2012, is what fans call the Dark Age of SpongeBob. And when you watch the episodes from this era, it's obvious why. The characters don't act like themselves anymore. And I'm not talking about subtle shifts. I'm talking about fundamental personality changes that make the characters feel like strangers wearing familiar skins. The fan community has a word for this: Flanderization, named after Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, who went from a nuanced, well-meaning neighbor to a one-note religious caricature. And in SpongeBob, the Flanderization hit every single character. SpongeBob went from a charming, eccentric optimist who was slightly slow on the uptake, but generally competent and well-meaning to, and I'm genuinely struggling to describe this without sounding hyperbolic, a manic, borderline psychotic man-child whose obliviousness isn't endearing anymore, it's actively dangerous. Patrick went from a lovable idiot whose dim-wittedness made sense in a funny, internal logic kind of way, to a character whose stupidity is aggressive and mean-spirited. Mr. Krabs went from a lovable cheapskate who clearly cared about his crew underneath his penny pinching, to a genuinely cruel capitalist who would commit crimes for spare change. Squidward went from a relatable grump who had his own depth and vulnerability to a punching bag who gets brutalized for no reason other than the writers needed something to happen in 11 minutes. And the writing shifted too. The show started relying heavily on 3 things that the original seasons mostly avoided: gross-out humor, character torture, and mean-spiritedness. The early SpongeBob had moments of visual absurdity, sure. The close-up gags, the weird faces, those were part of the show's DNA. But in the Dark Age, those elements went from being seasoning to being the whole meal. Episodes stopped being about clever setups and earned punchlines, and started being about watching characters suffer for 11 minutes straight, while the show seemed to think suffering was, in itself, funny. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into now, because I've organized tonight's journey around a question that I kept asking myself as I rewatched these episodes. What kind of bad is this? Because they're not all bad in the same way. Some of them are mean, some of them are gross, some of them are boring, some of them are all 3 at once, and some of them are so profoundly, confusingly bad that you genuinely wonder if something went wrong in the production process that nobody caught before air. So let me start with one that I think perfectly encapsulates everything that went wrong with SpongeBob during the Dark Age. And honestly, this might be the episode that made me angriest on this entire rewatch. One Course Meal, Season 7, Episode 11A. First aired March 25th, 2010. Written by Casey Alexander, Zeus Curvis, and Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence being, by the way, the voice actor for Plankton, which means the guy who plays Plankton co-wrote the episode where Plankton is psychologically tortured to the point of attempting to end his own life. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Here's what happens. Mr. Krabs discovers that Plankton is afraid of whales, specifically afraid of Pearl, his own daughter. So what does Mr. Krabs do with this information? He dresses up as Pearl and terrorizes Plankton, Not once, not twice. For 16 days straight, he stalks Plankton in a whale costume, showing up everywhere, tormenting him during the day, and invading his nightmares at night. Plankton stops eating, stops sleeping, becomes paranoid, has horrific dreams where Pearl swallows him whole. And then, and I genuinely cannot believe this aired on a children's network, Plankton walks into the middle of the road and lies down, waiting for the 4 o'clock bus to run him over. He tries to let himself get hit by a bus on Nickelodeon in a SpongeBob SquarePants episode. And here's what makes this even worse. SpongeBob is there. He sees what's happening. He even confronts Mr. Krabs about it. There's a moment where SpongeBob actually pushes back and tells Krabs that disguising himself to frighten Plankton is going too far. And for a second, you think the episode is going to course correct. You think it's going to say something meaningful about bullying, about empathy, about the line between rivalry and cruelty, but it doesn't. Instead, SpongeBob ends up helping Mr. Krabs anyway. Plankton gets a brief moment of revenge by exploiting Mr. Krabs' own fear of mimes, but SpongeBob immediately undercuts it by projecting holographic whales to scare Plankton away again. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs suffering essentially zero consequences. He got away with it. He drove someone to a breaking point, and the show rewards him for it. The fan response was, unsurprisingly, devastating. And this episode is regularly ranked as the #1 worst SpongeBob episode of all time by fan communities, YouTube critics, and ranked lists across the internet. WatchMojo put it at #1 on their worst list. Phantom Strider ranked it #1. It holds a 3.7 out of 10 on IMDb, alongside its paired episode, Gary in Love, making it the second lowest rated episode in the entire series. And this is the part that gets me. Clancy Brown, the voice of Mr. Krabs, reportedly expressed his own dislike of this episode. Even the actors knew something was wrong. And look, I've rewatched this episode probably 4 times putting this video together, and each time it makes me more uncomfortable. Not because of the subject matter itself. Shows can deal with dark themes if they handle them well, but One Course Meal doesn't handle it well. It treats psychological abuse as a prank. It treats the aftermath of that abuse, Plankton's total psychological collapse, as a plot device rather than a consequence. And then it wraps up with the abuser winning and the victim being re-traumatized. What lesson is a kid supposed to take from that? That bullying works? That if you exploit someone's deepest fears for over 2 weeks, you'll face no consequences? The original production title for this episode, by the way, was Plankton Got Served. They changed it to One Course Meal, a pun on One Course Meal, with coarse meaning rough. Even the title is making a joke about Plankton's suffering. I keep coming back to this question whenever I watch Dark Age SpongeBob. Did anyone in the room say, wait, should we not do this? Because it's not like the writers were inexperienced. Casey Alexander and Zeus Curvis were SpongeBob veterans. Mr. Lawrence has been with the show since the beginning. These are people who know the characters, who understand the show's DNA, and they still wrote this. Which makes me think the problem wasn't individual writers. It was the creative infrastructure. Without Hillenberg's direct oversight, without his specific sensibility filtering every story decision, the show lost its ability to recognize where the line was. The characters could go anywhere, do anything, and nobody was there to say, that's not what SpongeBob is. Okay, so that's Mr. Krabs at his worst. But I want to talk about what happens when SpongeBob himself becomes the villain. Because one of the most unsettling things about the Dark Age is how often the show takes its most lovable character and turns him into someone you actively dislike. And nowhere is that more stark than in A Pal for Gary. Season 7, Episode 5, B, aired January 2nd, 2010. And let me tell you, if One Course Meal made me angry, A Pal for Gary made me genuinely anxious. Because this is a Gary torture episode, and Gary is an innocent pet who has done nothing wrong, and watching him suffer while SpongeBob, the character who is supposed to love Gary more than anything, scolds him for it. It hits different. It hits wrong. The setup is simple enough. SpongeBob feels guilty about leaving Gary home alone while he goes to work at the Krusty Krab. So he decides to get Gary a companion, a new pet. He goes to a street vendor who explicitly warns him that the creature he's buying is dangerous, especially around other pets. The vendor shows him a picture of the creature snarling at another animal. She tells him, point blank, these things are unstable. SpongeBob ignores her completely. He brings home a nudibranch called Puffy Fluffy and introduces it to Gary. And what follows is 11 minutes of one of the most frustrating viewing experiences I've ever had with a cartoon. Puffy Fluffy immediately reveals its true nature to Gary. It's a monster. It snarls at him, threatens him, terrorizes him throughout the house. Gary is terrified, but every time SpongeBob walks into the room, Puffy Fluffy switches back to being cute and innocent, and SpongeBob blames Gary every single time. Gary tries to defend himself, and SpongeBob scolds him. Oh, the house gets destroyed overnight while SpongeBob sleeps through everything, and in the morning, he blames Gary for the mess. And then it gets worse. Puffy Fluffy transforms into this grotesque, multi-tentacled monster with mouths on the ends of its tongues. The kind of body horror that would be disturbing in an adult show, let alone a children's cartoon. It's actively trying to eat Gary alive. SpongeBob walks in on this. He literally watches Puffy Fluffy attempting to devour his pet. And what does he say? "Gary, put Puffy Fluffy down." He thinks Gary is the aggressor. He looks at his pet being consumed by a monster and blames his pet. Gary has to save himself and SpongeBob by lassoing Puffy Fluffy and chasing it away. And after Gary saves both their lives, SpongeBob's response is, "Gary, what do you have to say for yourself?" No apology, no recognition, no moment of clarity. SpongeBob never realizes what happened. He never thanks Gary. He never acknowledges that the vendor warned him. He just takes Gary to work the next day and moves on. I've seen people compare this episode to the Looney Tunes shorts with Sylvester and Porky Pig, specifically Claws for Alarm, where Sylvester protects Porky from dangers that Porky never sees. And sure, the formula is similar, but those Sylvester shorts work because they're built on comic irony. The audience knows what's happening, Porky doesn't, and the humor comes from the gap between those two perspectives. In A Pal for Gary, the audience knows what's happening and SpongeBob doesn't, but there's no humor in the gap. There's just frustration and cruelty because we're watching an animal suffer while its owner actively makes things worse. And at no point does the episode offer any catharsis, any recognition, any justice. Some people have pointed out that SpongeBob has always been oblivious, and that's true. It's part of his character. But in the classic episodes, his obliviousness was charming because it came from a place of innocence. He didn't know better. In A Pal for Gary, his obliviousness isn't innocent. It's willful. He ignores explicit warnings. He ignores visual evidence. He's not a lovable naif here. He's a negligent pet owner whose stubbornness puts his pet's life in danger. And that's not SpongeBob. That's a different character wearing SpongeBob's face. This episode holds a 3.2 out of 10 on IMDb, one of the lowest rated in the entire series. The Phantom Strider ranked it 8th on his list of worst episodes from good cartoons, describing it as the closest thing I've seen to animal torture in a cartoon. And honestly, I think he's right. This episode is uncomfortable in a way that most bad SpongeBob episodes aren't, because the victim is genuinely helpless, and the person who should be protecting him is the one putting him in danger. And that leads me to something I've been thinking about a lot during this rewatch, which is the concept of the torture episode. Because this is a genre that essentially didn't exist in the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob, and then became the show's default mode during the Dark Age. A torture episode, in SpongeBob fan terminology, is an episode where the primary narrative engine is the prolonged suffering of a main character, usually Squidward, and sometimes SpongeBob, occasionally Plankton or Gary, with no earned resolution, and often no consequences for the characters causing the suffering. Think about how different that is from the classic approach. In the early seasons, bad things happened to characters. Sure, Squidward got annoyed by SpongeBob constantly. SpongeBob failed his driving test over and over. Mr. Krabs' cheapness got him into trouble. But those things happened within stories that had structure, purpose, and usually some kind of moral logic. Squidward's misfortune in Band Geeks leads to genuine triumph. SpongeBob's struggles in pizza delivery lead to a moment of real friendship with Squidward. The suffering had context and payoff. In the torture episodes, the suffering is the point. There's no journey, no lesson, no growth. Just 11 minutes of watching a character you've known for years get ground down for no reason. And the show seems to think this is funny. Let me give you another example that I think illustrates this perfectly. Stuck in the Ringer, Season 7, Episode 2, B, aired July 19th, 2009. SpongeBob accidentally gets stuck in his ringer, the thing he uses to dry off after a shower. Patrick shows up and, instead of helping SpongeBob get free, uses something called Forever Glue to permanently seal him inside it. And from there, the episode is just SpongeBob trying to live his life while trapped in this thing. He can't work. He can't eat ice cream. The ringer blocks his esophagus. He gets hurt at the carnival, while Patrick has a great time ignoring his suffering. And here's the moment that everyone remembers. SpongeBob finally snaps. Well, he yells at Patrick. He tells him the truth, that Patrick ruined his life with the Forever Glue, and everything that's happened is Patrick's fault. And Patrick runs away crying, which, in a just universe, would be the end of it. SpongeBob spoke up for himself. Patrick was wrong. The end. But no, the citizens of Bikini Bottom see SpongeBob yelling at Patrick, and without knowing any context, they gang up on SpongeBob. They tell him he has no heart. They tell him he deserves to be stuck in the ringer. They publicly shame him for standing up for himself against the person who caused all of his suffering. The episode's resolution involves both SpongeBob and Patrick crying enough tears to dissolve the glue, which is played as a lesson, with SpongeBob saying to camera, "I guess crying does solve your problems after all." That's the moral. Crying solves your problems. In a SpongeBob SquarePants episode aimed at children, and it's delivered directly to camera, breaking the fourth wall, as if the show is genuinely trying to teach kids this lesson. This episode holds a 4.1 out of 10 on IMDb, and while it's not as universally reviled as One Course Meal or A Pal for Gary, I actually think it might be more insidious, because the message it sends is deeply messed up. It says, if someone hurts you, don't stand up for yourself, because everyone will turn against you. It says, the victim is always wrong for being angry. It says, the person who caused the problem is the real victim, and you should feel bad for calling them out. And I know, it's a cartoon. I know I'm reading too much into it, but kids watch this stuff. The kids internalize messages about when it's okay to speak up and when it's not. And Stuck in the Ringer tells them explicitly that speaking up makes you the bad guy. All right, let me shift gears for a moment, because I want to talk about a different kind of bad. Everything we've discussed so far has been about mean-spiritedness, episodes that are cruel to their characters in ways that feel wrong. But the Dark Age of SpongeBob had another mode of failure that's equally notable, even if it's less emotionally disturbing, and that's the Gross Out episode. The Splinter, Season 6, Episode 5A, aired June 2nd, 2008. And I want to be precise about why this episode matters in the conversation about SpongeBob's worst moments, because the gross out issue is more nuanced than people think. SpongeBob has always had gross out humor. The show debuted with close-up shots of weird textures, bulging eyes, and absurd physical transformations. Those are part of the show's visual language. But in the classic seasons, gross out was a tool, a momentary cutaway, a quick visual gag that punctuated a joke and moved on. In The Splinter, gross out is the entire episode. It's 11 minutes of SpongeBob's thumb getting increasingly infected, swollen, discolored, and pus-filled after he gets a splinter at work. That's it. That's the plot. SpongeBob gets a splinter. His thumb gets gross. Patrick makes it worse by hammering the splinter deeper and putting garbage on it. Mr. Krabs eventually pulls it out, causing a volcanic eruption of green pus. The end. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob himself, has reportedly said this is his least favorite episode of the entire series. Let me say that again. The man who has given voice to SpongeBob SquarePants for over 25 years considers this his least favorite 11 minutes of the show he's been part of since day one. That should tell you something. And here's what frustrates me about The Splinter. It's not just gross. Gross can work. Ren and Stimpy was gross constantly, and it was brilliant. The issue is that The Splinter has nothing else going for it. There's no character development. There's no story arc. There are no jokes that exist independent of the grossness. The episode is asking you to find the progressive infection of a cartoon sponge's thumb inherently funny for 11 straight minutes. And if you don't, and most people don't, then there's nothing else here for you. Season 6, by the way, is widely regarded as the beginning of the Dark Age proper. It premiered on March 3rd, 2008, and ran through July 5th, 2010, spanning 26 half-hour episodes. And the volume of bad episodes in this season is striking. Beyond The Splinter, you've got Boating Buddies, Choir Boys, Truth or Square, the list goes on. This is the season where it became clear to most fans that something fundamental had changed about the show. But I want to be careful here, because I don't want to suggest that every episode in seasons 6 through 8 is terrible. They're not. There are genuinely good episodes scattered throughout this period. Sandcastles in the Sand is great. Frozen Face Off is a solid adventure. It's a SpongeBob Christmas is legitimately wonderful. The Dark Age isn't a monolith. It's more like a terrain with occasional peaks rising out of a swamp. The peaks are there, but you have to wade through a lot of muck to find them. Speaking of muck, let me talk about Atlantis SquarePantis, Season 5, Episode 12. First aired November 12th, 2007. Now technically, Season 5 is considered pre-Dark Age by most fans, and there's a strong argument that Season 5 is actually the last generally well-received season. But Atlantis SquarePantis is an interesting case because it represents a different kind of failure. Not mean-spiritedness or gross out, but corporate-mandated mediocrity. Here's what happened. According to writer Danny McKaylee's Twitter, this episode was originally conceived as a standard 11-minute SpongeBob and Patrick episode, but Nickelodeon requested that it be expanded into a full-length TV movie. And so the writers had to stretch an 11-minute idea across 45 minutes. And you can feel it in every scene. The episode is padded beyond belief. There are seven musical numbers. The Patchy the Pirate framing device adds nothing. The character arcs are paper thin. SpongeBob likes bubbles. Squidward likes art. Mr. Krabs likes money. Sandy likes science. Plankton likes weapons. Those are the characters' defining traits, presented with zero depth or subversion. David Bowie, guest starred as the voice of Lord Royal Highness, the King of Atlantis. And Tom Kenny himself described the episode as an adventurous quest, kind of a story about SpongeBob and his friends journeying and discovering the lost continent of Atlantis, which is ruled by a character voiced by David Bowie. That should have been amazing. And they had David Bowie in a SpongeBob episode, and it still didn't work. The episode pulled massive ratings. When it first aired, it attracted an estimated 8.8 to 9.22 million viewers, the highest rated episode premiere in the show's history at that point. So Nickelodeon got exactly what they wanted commercially, but the critical reception was brutal. Tom Shales of the Washington Post wrote a review under the headline, "Squeezing the Life Out of SpongeBob," calling the episode's title the funniest thing about it, and describing the musical numbers as numbing. Even Casey Alexander, one of the episode's own writers, later said this was his least favorite SpongeBob episode to work on. And this is where I want to introduce something that I think is crucial to understanding why SpongeBob declined. Then the network's commercial priorities and the show's creative interests were moving in completely opposite directions. Nickelodeon wanted events. They wanted specials. They wanted longer episodes, musical numbers, celebrity guest stars, merchandise tie-ins. What SpongeBob needed was the thing Hillenburg had given it: tight, focused, 11-minute stories with no agenda other than being funny and surprising, and occasionally quietly moving. Atlantis SquarePantis is what happens when you make SpongeBob conform to what the network thinks kids want instead of what actually makes the show good. And that dynamic played out again 2 years later with Truth or Square, the show's 10th anniversary special, which aired November 6th, 2009, and which is almost universally considered a worse anniversary celebration than what the show deserved. It was padded with meandering, patchy segments, endless flashbacks, and the infamous bait and switch around SpongeBob and Sandy's wedding, which turned out to be a play. Fans felt tricked. The anniversary special for one of the most beloved shows in Nickelodeon history felt like it had been designed by a marketing department, rather than by people who understood why anyone loved SpongeBob in the first place. And look, I keep going back to Steven Hillenburg, because I think his absence is the single most important factor in SpongeBob's decline. Not the only factor. The writers who remained bore responsibility for individual creative choices. Nickelodeon's commercial pressure was real and corrosive. The shift to digital animation on Wacom Cintiq tablets changed the visual feel of the show in ways that made it look cheaper and more restricted. All of these things mattered, but Hillenburg was the filter. He was the person who had the authority and the artistic sensibility to say, "No, SpongeBob wouldn't do that," or "No, that joke goes too far," or "No, we don't need a musical number here, we need a story." Without that filter, the show was capable of anything, and anything turns out to include psychological torture, animal cruelty, suicide references, and 11 minutes of pus. Let me move forward and talk about Pet Sitter Pat, Season 8, Episode 12. B. This is a late Dark Age entry, from the season that most fans consider a slight improvement over Season 6 and 7, but still well below the show's standard. And this episode is worth discussing because it combines two of the Dark Age's worst tendencies: Gary torture and Patrick at his most maliciously idiotic. The premise is simple. SpongeBob needs someone to watch Gary while he's away. He asks Patrick, and Patrick proceeds to torment Gary for the entire episode. Not out of malice exactly, but out of an incompetence so extreme that it functionally becomes cruelty. He tries to give Gary a bath in ways that are dangerous and frightening. He handles Gary roughly. He makes decisions so profoundly stupid that Gary is in constant peril. And the thing that makes this different from early season Patrick is the motivation, or rather, the lack of it. In the classic episodes, Patrick's stupidity had a logic to it. He operated on his own internal reasoning that, while absurd, was consistent. You could follow the thread of his thinking even when his conclusions were wrong. In Pet Sitter Pat, Patrick's stupidity exists solely to generate suffering. There's no internal logic. There's no comic reasoning. He's stupid because the plot needs someone to hurt Gary, and Patrick is the character designated to do it. I actually have a theory about this that I've never heard anyone else bring up. I think the reason the Dark Age writers kept defaulting to Patrick as torturer is that Patrick is the easiest character to write badly. When you're writing SpongeBob or Squidward or Mr. Krabs, there are certain things you have to get right for the character to feel recognizable. SpongeBob's enthusiasm, Squidward's aspirations, Mr. Krabs' relationship with money. But Patrick's defining trait is that he's dumb. And if the only thing you're giving a character is dumb, you can make him do literally anything and justify it with, well, he's Patrick. He's stupid. It's a blank check for lazy writing, and the Dark Age cashed that check constantly. But here's where things get really interesting, because I want to shift the entire frame of this conversation. We've spent the first half of tonight talking about the worst episodes as failures, as creative missteps, as departures from what SpongeBob should be, and they are that. I've been pretty clear about how I feel. These episodes are bad. Many of them are genuinely harmful in terms of the messages they send to young viewers. But, and this is the part I've been building to, the part where I need you to reconsider everything I've said so far. These episodes are also, in a weird and uncomfortable way, that the most honest depictions of what SpongeBob's world actually is when you strip away the optimistic filter. Stay with me. I know that sounds like I'm defending them. I'm not. But I think there's something important hiding inside these failures, and most people miss it because they're too busy, rightfully, being upset. Think about what Bikini Bottom actually is. It's a town where your boss pays you in counterfeit money, Mr. Krabs' wacky bucks, as revealed in one-course meal. It's a place where your neighbor openly despises you, and you're too oblivious to notice. It's a world where a single employer controls the entire local economy and keeps his workers in a state of perpetual servitude. It's a community where the police are incompetent, the justice system is arbitrary, and mob mentality can turn on you in an instant, as SpongeBob discovers in Stuck in the Ringer, when the entire population shames him for standing up for himself. The first 3 seasons of SpongeBob presented this world through a lens of optimism and absurdist joy. SpongeBob's relentless positivity made the darkness bearable, even invisible. You didn't notice that Mr. Krabs was exploiting SpongeBob because SpongeBob was so happy to be exploited. You didn't notice that Squidward's life was miserable because the show treated his misery as comedy, and his occasional victories, Band Geeks specifically, proved that the world wasn't completely rigged against him. But the Dark Age episodes removed that filter. They showed you what Bikini Bottom looks like without SpongeBob's optimism softening the edges. And what it looks like is pretty grim. Mr. Krabs is cruel. He would drive someone to a breaking point for a competitive advantage. SpongeBob is oblivious to the suffering of those around him, even those he claims to love. Patrick is dangerous. The citizens of Bikini Bottom are a thoughtless mob. These aren't inventions of the Dark Age. They're exaggerations of things that were always there. Now, and this is important, I'm not saying this makes the Dark Age episodes good. They're still bad television. They take genuine character traits and strip away all the nuance, all the counterbalancing humanity, all the comic skill that made those traits work in the early seasons. They're like if someone took an X-ray of SpongeBob's world and showed you only the skeleton, technically accurate, but missing everything that makes the body beautiful. But I think there's a reason these episodes fascinate people. I think there's a reason the SpongeBob fan community hasn't just forgotten about them and moved on. Because buried inside each of these terrible episodes is an uncomfortable truth about the show we love. And engaging with that truth, even when it's presented badly, is more interesting than pretending it doesn't exist. Take Demolition Doofus, Season 8, Episode 12. A. Mrs. Puff, sweet, long-suffering Mrs. Puff, has her puff permanently deflated after yet another SpongeBob driving disaster. And in her grief and frustration, She enters SpongeBob in a demolition derby, hoping he'll be destroyed. Mrs. Puff wants SpongeBob dead. She actively plots his murder, and every fan who watched this episode recoiled. Mrs. Puff would never do that, they said. And they're right, the Mrs. Puff of the first 3 seasons would never go that far. But the Mrs. Puff of the first 3 seasons also hadn't been through 13 seasons of SpongeBob's incompetence. If you actually track her experience across the entire series, every failed test, every destroyed building, every near-death experience she's had because of SpongeBob's driving, her descent into homicidal rage isn't just understandable, it's almost inevitable. The Dark Age episode just followed the logic that the classic episodes kept avoiding. Does that make it a good episode? No. It's clumsy. It's tonally wrong for SpongeBob, and it doesn't earn its darkness the way a show like BoJack Horseman or Moral Orel might. But there's something real in it that I think deserves more than dismissal. And that brings me to the episode that might be the most philosophically interesting failure in the entire series. Squid Baby, Season 9, Episode 3. B. A head injury causes Squidward to mentally regress to infancy, and SpongeBob and Patrick have to care for him. The episode is gross. It's uncomfortable. It's been compared to fetish content by multiple critics, and it's basically a lesser version of Rockabye Bivalve from Season 3 without any of the charm. But think about what the episode is actually about. It's about Squidward losing everything that makes him Squidward. His intelligence, his dignity, his self-awareness, his artistic pretensions, and being reduced to a helpless dependent in the care of the 2 people who have always driven him crazy. It's a nightmare scenario for Squidward. It's literally his worst fear made manifest. And the episode plays it entirely for laughs, which is exactly what SpongeBob has always done with Squidward's suffering. The difference is that in Band Geeks, or Christmas Who, or Dying for Pie, the show balanced Squidward's misery with moments of genuine connection, surprise, or triumph. In Squid Baby, there's no balance. It's just the misery, stripped of everything that makes it bearable. I've been watching SpongeBob more times than I can count, and this might be the most important thing I've realized during this rewatch. The worst episodes of SpongeBob aren't bad because they introduce darkness into the show. They're bad because they introduce darkness without craft, without skill, without the understanding that darkness only works when it's in conversation with something lighter. Hillenburg understood this intuitively. Nasty Patty, the episode where SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs think they've killed a health inspector, is one of the darkest episodes of the entire series, and it's from Season 3, and it's brilliant, because Hillenburg knew how to make darkness funny without making it cruel. The Dark Age writers had the darkness, but not the craft, and that's the tragedy. Let me talk about Little Yellow Book, Season 9, Episode 4. A aired March 2nd, 2013. Because this episode does something that I think is genuinely rare in bad television. It manages to make every single character unlikable simultaneously. Squidward finds SpongeBob's work diary at the Krusty Krab and reads it aloud to all the customers. He reveals SpongeBob's secrets, that he clucks like a chicken when he sees Plaid, that he named his spatula Fifi, that he dances in his underwear when he hears the Bikini Bottom national anthem. The customers all laugh along. SpongeBob walks in, realizes what's happening, and runs out crying. And then, here's the part that makes this episode truly infuriating. All the customers who were laughing along with Squidward suddenly turn on him. They act shocked. That was that little dude's diary, they say, as if Squidward hadn't explicitly told them what it was from the beginning. They shame Squidward. They harass him. His house gets repossessed. He gets struck by lightning. The entire town makes him a pariah for the exact thing they participated in. The hypocrisy is staggering. And unlike in a well-written episode, the hypocrisy isn't the point. The show doesn't seem to realize it's being hypocritical. And it presents the townspeople's outrage as justified, as if they genuinely didn't know they were enjoying someone's private diary being read aloud. It's not satire, it's not commentary, it's just bad writing that accidentally reveals how arbitrary the moral logic of Bikini Bottom actually is. And then the ending. Squidward apologizes to SpongeBob. SpongeBob forgives him. Moment of reconciliation. But wait. Squidward immediately reveals that he's found SpongeBob's personal diary, as opposed to his work diary, and starts reading that too. SpongeBob runs away crying again. The townsfolk throw tomatoes at Squidward, who laughs and says it's worth it. End of episode. No growth, no lesson, no consequences that stick, just cruelty, hypocrisy, and a reset to the status quo, which again, is something SpongeBob has always done. It's an episodic show. Things don't carry over, but in the classic episodes, The reset didn't feel cynical because each episode stood on its own as a satisfying piece of storytelling. In Little Yellow Book, the reset feels like the show acknowledging that nothing that happened mattered and that it doesn't care. This episode holds a 5.4 out of 10 on IMDb, which is higher than One Course Meal or A Pal for Gary, but still abysmal by SpongeBob standards. And there's one incredibly ironic thing about it that I need to mention. The scene where SpongeBob clucks like a chicken became the basis for the mocking SpongeBob meme. You know the one. The alternating caps meme that became one of the most widely used internet memes in the late 2000s. One of the worst episodes of SpongeBob created one of the most iconic SpongeBob memes. The show's failures were so culturally pervasive that even they became part of SpongeBob's lasting impact on internet culture. You honestly can't make this stuff up. Let me circle back to something I said earlier, because I think it's even more true than I initially realized. I said the worst episodes are more interesting than some of the best ones. And I want to be more specific about what I mean. When you watch Band Geeks, it's perfect. There's nothing to analyze. There's nothing to argue about. Squidward wants to impress Squilliam. He assembles a band. It goes terribly. Then, at the last moment, everyone comes together and performs Sweet Victory, and it's one of the greatest moments in television history. Done. Perfect. What else is there to say? But when you watch One Course Meal, you can talk for hours. You can talk about the ethics of children's programming, about what it means when a show normalizes psychological abuse, about why the same writers who created Beautiful Stories decided this was acceptable, about the production pipeline that allowed it to air, about what it reveals about Nickelodeon's priorities, about the relationship between commercial success and creative decline, about flanderization and character integrity, about what we owe to the audience, especially a young audience, in terms of the stories we tell and the messages we embed. The best episodes of SpongeBob are transcendent, but the worst episodes are instructive, and I think there's immense value in studying failure, especially when it's the failure of something that was once this good. I want to talk about Ink Lemonade now. Season 11, Episode 11A, because this one came as a shock. By Season 11, SpongeBob had genuinely improved. Steven Hillenburg had returned to the show in January 2015 as executive producer for the second half of Season 9. Classic crew members like Sherm Cohen came back. The animation returned to hand-drawn methods in Season 9B. The characters started behaving like themselves again. Seasons 10 and 11 were widely praised as a return to form. And then Ink Lemonade aired, and it was like a flashback to the darkest days. Patrick runs a lemonade stand. Nobody's buying. Then Squidward accidentally gets scared near the stand and shoots ink. You know, because octopuses produce ink, and it lands in the lemonade. Suddenly, people love it. So Patrick and SpongeBob spend the rest of the episode finding increasingly sadistic ways to frighten Squidward, so he'll keep producing ink for their lemonade stand. They scare him with a bullhorn. Patrick reveals his own internal organs to terrify him. They use a giant spider. They build an entire haunted house outside Squidward's home. This is a Squidward torture episode in a season that was supposed to be past all that. And the grossness factor is off the charts. People are drinking octopus ink and loving it, which is disgusting enough, but the methods of extracting it are what really push the episode into unwatchable territory. Roger Bumpass, Squidward's voice actor, called this the hardest episode he ever worked on, describing a recording process where he had to scream, spray, and scream again repeatedly until it wrecked his voice for a month or so. Even the production process was tortuous. And the thing that gets me about Ink Lemonade is the timing. This was 2018. Hillenburg was back. The show was better, and this still got through, which tells me that even with Hillenburg's presence, the institutional habits of post-movie SpongeBob were hard to shake. The Dark Age left scars on the show's creative DNA that couldn't be fully healed. Hillenburg passed away on November 26, 2018, at the age of 57, from complications related to ALS, which he had been diagnosed with in March 2017. He had announced his diagnosis publicly, saying he would continue to work on SpongeBob for as long as I am able. His ashes were scattered off the coast of Los Angeles County, California. And I think about that a lot in the context of these episodes, because Hillenburg spent the last years of his life returning to the thing he'd created, trying to steer it back toward what it was supposed to be, and by many accounts, he succeeded. The later seasons of SpongeBob are generally well received. The show found its footing again, more or less. But the worst episodes, the one-course meals, and the A Pal for Gary's. They can't be unaired. They're part of the show's history. They're part of what SpongeBob is. And I think Hillenburg knew that. There's a quote that Sherm Cohen shared in a New York Times interview, where Hillenburg told him, "My biggest nightmare is that I'm going to be at the beach one day, and one of these dolls is going to wash up on the shore like garbage." He was talking about merchandising, about the environmental consequences of an infinitely marketed cartoon franchise. But I think the sentiment applies more broadly. Hillenburg was a marine biologist. He cared about ecosystems. He understood that when you put something into the world, you can't always control where it ends up or what it becomes. SpongeBob's worst episodes are the garbage that washed ashore. They're what happens when a creative ecosystem loses its caretaker. And they're a reminder that no show, no matter how good, is immune to the pressures that turn art into product. I want to end tonight's journey by talking about one more episode, and then leaving you with a question I genuinely don't have an answer to. SpongeBob, You're Fired, Season 9, Episode 1. First aired November 11th, 2013. Then this was promoted as a half-hour special, 22 minutes instead of the usual 11, and it's often cited as the worst SpongeBob special ever produced. Worse than Atlantis SquarePantis, worse than Truth or Square, and it aired in Season 9, which makes it sting even more because Season 9 is supposed to be the beginning of SpongeBob's recovery. The plot: Mr. Krabs fires SpongeBob to save a nickel. A nickel. SpongeBob, his most loyal, dedicated, unpaid overtime working employee, gets fired over 5 cents. And then the episode follows SpongeBob as he tries to find work at other restaurants, gets fired from all of them, gets kidnapped by the restaurant owners who all want him back, and eventually returns to the Krusty Krab when it becomes clear that without SpongeBob, the food is terrible. The problem isn't the premise. SpongeBob gets fired could be a great episode. There's real emotional potential there. SpongeBob's identity is wrapped up in his job at the Krusty Krab, and exploring what happens when that's taken away from him could be genuinely moving. But the execution is filled with padding, filler, and an extended crying sequence that goes on long enough to make you uncomfortable. SpongeBob's suffering isn't poignant, it's tedious. And the resolution, Mr. Krabs installs a pay toilet to make up for the nickel, is such an insultingly small payoff for 22 minutes of screen time that you feel cheated. This episode holds a 4.2 out of 10 on IMDb. Fan blogger Tyler730 on the SpongeBob wiki called it the worst episode ever created. And what frustrates me most about it is the wasted potential. SpongeBob losing his job should matter, and it should be an event. But because the show has no continuity, no lasting consequences, and no interest in letting its characters grow, the episode can't explore the premise with any depth. SpongeBob gets fired. SpongeBob gets hired back. Nothing changes. Nothing means anything. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem with SpongeBob's worst episodes. Not the cruelty, not the grossness, not the Flanderization. It's the meaninglessness. The classic SpongeBob episodes felt like they mattered within their 11 minutes. Each one was a small, self-contained world with its own emotional logic, its own payoffs, its own reasons for existing. The worst episodes feel like time being killed. Like the show is running out the clock on a series that was supposed to end in 2004. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. And I'm being serious. I don't have an answer, and I've been turning it over in my head for weeks. Should SpongeBob have ended when Steven Hillenburg wanted it to? Because on one hand, and this is the obvious answer, yes, of course. The first 3 seasons plus the first movie is a near perfect body of work. If SpongeBob had ended there, it would be remembered as one of the greatest animated series ever made, period. No qualifiers, no but the later seasons, no one-course meal, no A Pal for Gary. Just 3 flawless seasons and a movie, etched in amber, forever perfect. But on the other hand, we wouldn't have Sand Castles in the Sand. We wouldn't have It's a SpongeBob Christmas. We wouldn't have Mimic Madness, or Plankton's Pet, or SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout. We wouldn't have the Super Bowl halftime controversy, which kept SpongeBob in the cultural conversation in a way that nothing else could have. We wouldn't have the memes, Mocking SpongeBob, Imagination SpongeBob, Confused, Mr. Krabs. That made SpongeBob the defining cartoon of internet culture. We wouldn't have Hillenburg's return in 2015, his final creative chapter with the characters he loved. we wouldn't have the show's influence on 2 full generations of comedy writers, animators, and internet creators who grew up with SpongeBob still on the air. Would the cultural impact have been the same if SpongeBob had ended in 2004? Honestly, I don't think so. I think SpongeBob's continued presence, even at its worst, kept it alive in the cultural bloodstream in a way that a finished show can't match. The worst episodes of SpongeBob are part of the conversation. They're part of the discourse. And they're part of why we're still talking about a cartoon that debuted in 1999. So was it worth it? The decline? The dark age? The episodes we spent tonight picking apart? Were they the price of SpongeBob's enduring relevance? I don't know. I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I still don't know. What I do know is this. When Steven Hillenburg was pitching SpongeBob to Nickelodeon in 1997, he wore a Hawaiian shirt, brought an underwater terrarium with models of the characters, and played Hawaiian music to set the mood. Eric Coleman, the executive who heard the pitch, described the setup as pretty amazing. And the show that came from that pitch, the show that a marine biology teacher created because he loved the ocean and wanted to make people laugh, that show changed television. It changed comedy. It changed the internet. It changed the way an entire generation thinks about cartoons and what they can be. The worst episodes of SpongeBob can't undo that. Nothing can. SpongeBob at its worst is still a show that matters, that provokes conversation, that makes people care enough to argue about which episodes are the most awful. You don't argue about shows you don't love. You don't spend 2 hours breaking down bad episodes of a cartoon you don't deeply, fundamentally care about. So if you've made it this far, and if you have, thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with me tonight. I want you to carry this thought with you. The worst episodes of SpongeBob exist because of the same impulse that created the best ones. The desire to keep making this show, to keep telling stories about this strange little sponge who lives in a pineapple under the sea. And that impulse was right and pure when Hillenburg was driving it. It was corrupted when commercial interests took over, but it was never gone. And the show's later recovery, its return to quality, its reconnection with what made it special, proves that the impulse survived even the darkest age. SpongeBob SquarePants has produced over 330 episodes across 16 seasons. Its 4th movie, The SpongeBob Movie, Search for SquarePants, released in December 2025. It's been on the air for over a quarter of a century and shows no signs of stopping. It has generated over $16 billion in merchandise revenue. It's the longest-running American children's animated series in history. And somewhere in there, between the masterpieces and the disasters, but between band geeks and one-course meal, between the show Steven Hillenburg created and the show Nickelodeon refused to let end, is the truth about what it means to make something that matters. You can't control it forever. You can't protect it from everyone. But if you made it right in the beginning, if the foundation was strong enough, then even the worst things that happen to it can't destroy what it was. I think Steven Hillenburg understood that. I think that's why he came back. And I think, wherever he is, he'd be okay knowing that people are still arguing about his show at 2 in the morning. Even the bad parts. Maybe especially the bad parts. But I'm not done yet. Because there are episodes we haven't talked about. And some of them reveal things about SpongeBob's decline that the big, infamous ones actually obscure. Everyone talks about One Course Meal and A Pal for Gary. But there are episodes that are bad in quieter, more insidious ways. Episodes that didn't generate the same outrage, but that I think did more cumulative damage to the show's identity. And if you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a light video. So let me keep going. To Love a Patty, Season 5, Episode 7A, aired July 26th, 2007. And I want to talk about this one because it sits right at the transition point between classic SpongeBob and the Dark Age, and you can feel the tectonic plates shifting. The premise: SpongeBob makes such a perfect Krabby Patty that he falls in love with it, literally. In love. He takes it on dates. He sings to it. He ignores his friends. Patrick and Sandy both come over wanting to hang out. And SpongeBob blows them off to spend time with a sandwich. He takes the patty to the Valentine's Day carnival, to the mall, to the beach. And when scallops try to eat the patty, SpongeBob uses karate to kill 21 of them to protect it. 21 scallops, dead, for a sandwich. In the early seasons, SpongeBob caught jellyfish. He played with them. He was gentle with sea creatures because that's who he was. The character created by a marine biology educator who loved ocean life. And now, here he is, massacring scallops for a burger. The storyboard artist Kenny Pittenger wrote on his blog, about having to create the painting of the rotting Krabby Patty for this episode, and describing how the initial version wasn't disgusting enough, and he was asked to make it even more revolting, something that turned my stomach a few times as I was working on it. And that detail fascinates me, because it shows you the creative process during this era. The instinct wasn't, how do we make this funnier? It was, how do we make this grosser? The metric for success had changed. The show wasn't chasing laughs anymore. It was chasing reactions. The second half of the episode is just the patty decomposing while SpongeBob stays in denial. Close-ups of mold, flies buzzing, green discoloration, and then, in the end, Mr. Krabs tells SpongeBob that he too once fell in love with a Krabby Patty, but Krabby Patties are meant to be loved and eaten. SpongeBob eats the rotting patty and feels sick. The end. This episode is what I'd call a warning sign. It's not as aggressively bad as the season 6 and 7 episodes that would follow, but it shows you the DNA of what was coming. The gross out escalation, the character behaving in ways that feel fundamentally wrong, the mistaking of shock for comedy. To Love a Patty is the episode where SpongeBob started becoming someone else, and most people didn't notice because the really awful stuff hadn't started yet. Let me talk about the Squidward problem, because I think it's one of the most underanalyzed aspects of SpongeBob's decline. In the first 3 seasons, Squidward is arguably the show's most complex character. He's a failed artist. He's a self-important snob who doesn't have the talent to back up his ego. He's lonely in ways he'd never admit. He looks down on SpongeBob and Patrick. But there are moments, beautiful, fleeting moments, where you can see that he needs them more than he knows. Band Geeks, Season 2, Episode 15. B. Squidward's clarinet rival, Squilliam Fancyson, challenges him to put together a band for the Bubble Bowl. The rehearsals are a disaster. Squidward loses hope. And then, at the last moment, the citizens of Bikini Bottom, led by SpongeBob, pull together and perform Sweet Victory in one of the most genuinely triumphant moments in animated television. Squidward wins. He gets his moment, and the show lets him have it without a punchline, without a reversal, without pulling the rug out. That restraint, the decision to give a character a genuine victory, is one of the rarest and most beautiful things in comedy. And it only works because the show spent so much time establishing Squidward's yearning, his frustration, his desperate need to prove himself. In the Dark Age, that Squidward is gone. What replaces him is a punching bag. Episodes like Boating Buddies, where Squidward gets sentenced to boating school with SpongeBob for no real reason, and spends 11 minutes being tormented. Choir Boys, where SpongeBob obsessively stalks Squidward to prevent him from auditioning for a choir. An episode the fan community on SpongeBuddy Mania rated a devastating 1.81 out of 10, the lowest score on their entire database. Cephalopod Lodge, where SpongeBob and Patrick get Squidward kicked out of his secret club and then make things worse while trying to help. The pattern is always the same. Squidward has something he cares about. SpongeBob ruins it. Squidward suffers. The end. There's no counterbalance. No moment where Squidward's suffering leads somewhere meaningful. No sweet victory, just pain. And this is where I actually get angry. Because Squidward's suffering in the classic episodes worked precisely because it wasn't gratuitous. When something bad happened to Squidward, it was usually because of his own arrogance, or because of comic circumstances that felt organic. And when the show decided to give him a break, Band Geeks, Christmas Who, Dying for Pie, those moments landed because they were earned. They were surprises in a world that usually went the other direction. In the Dark Age, Squidward's suffering is the default state. It's not a comedic choice. It's a lack of imagination. The writers couldn't figure out what to do with Squidward except hurt him. So they hurt him constantly, and they confused the audience's discomfort for entertainment. Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy is another one I need to talk about. Season 7, Episode 1. A. Aired July 19th, 2009. This is what I'd call a hypocrisy episode. An episode where the internal logic of Bikini Bottom breaks down so completely that you can't take anything that happens seriously. Plankton steals Sandy's fur to disguise himself as her and try to get the Krabby Patty secret formula from SpongeBob. Sandy, now without her fur, has to walk through Bikini Bottom in her bikini, which, for the record, is what she always wears under her suit. The Bikini Bottomites, many of whom don't wear clothes at all, mock her for being naked. They call her a naked chipmunk, a nudist ferret, a hairless goat. And at the end of the episode, after Sandy defeats Plankton and gets her fur back, the police arrest her for public nudity. Let me spell that out. In a town full of fish who wear nothing, a squirrel wearing a bikini gets arrested for being naked. The victim of a robbery gets punished for being robbed. And the show plays this completely straight. It's not satirizing the absurdity. It doesn't comment on the hypocrisy. It just presents it as the ending, as if this is a normal and acceptable conclusion to a story. This is what I mean when I say, the Dark Age broke Bikini Bottom. The town in the early seasons had its own consistent absurdist logic. Things didn't have to make real-world sense, but they made SpongeBob sense. Someone's in the kitchen with Sandy doesn't make any kind of sense. It's just cruelty, dressed up as a plot resolution. And Sandy, a character who in the early seasons was tough, smart, and one of the most capable people in Bikini Bottom, is reduced to a humiliation object. Actually, let me talk about Sandy's Flanderization for a moment, because she might be the character who lost the most during the Dark Age. In seasons 1 through 3, Sandy Cheeks was an action hero. She was a karate expert, an inventor, a daredevil. She was proud of her Texas heritage in a way that gave her real personality and warmth. She was one of the few characters who could match SpongeBob's energy while also grounding him. Her friendship with SpongeBob felt genuine and specific. They bonded over karate, over adventure, over a shared willingness to throw themselves into things. Starting around season 5, Sandy's character got reduced to basically one trait: scientist. Her karate skills disappeared. Her Texas identity faded to an occasional reference. She became the designated smart character whose job was to explain things and do science. And that might sound like a minor change, but it gutted what made her interesting. Sandy was interesting because she was a contradiction, a thrill-seeking cowgirl from Texas who's also a genius who lives underwater in a glass dome. Take away the cowgirl, and you've just got a lab coat with a southern accent. The thing about SpongeBob is that it rewards rewatching in a way that almost no other animated show does. Every single time you go back to the early seasons, you catch something new, a background gag, a throwaway line that's actually brilliantly written, a character moment that's so subtle you missed it the first 5 times. And every single time you rewatch the Dark Age episodes, you notice something new too, but it's always something wrong. Another inconsistency, another character acting against their nature, another scene that doesn't land. I've rewatched Choir Boys probably 3 times for this video. Season 6, episode 12B. And each time, I notice how aggressively SpongeBob stalks Squidward in it. SpongeBob doesn't just annoy Squidward in this episode. He actively, deliberately sabotages Squidward's attempt to audition for the Bikini Bottom men's chorus. He follows him. He blocks his path. He inserts himself into the audition. And the episode presents this as SpongeBob being his usual lovable self, just wanting to hang out with his neighbor. But that's not what's happening on screen. What's happening on screen is harassment. And SpongeBob is preventing Squidward from pursuing something he's passionate about. And the episode doesn't seem to realize that's what it's showing us. This is one of those episodes I think about randomly at like 2 in the morning. Not because it's particularly memorable, but because it captures something essential about what went wrong. In the classic episodes, SpongeBob annoyed Squidward by existing, by being loud, by being cheerful, by being present. It wasn't malicious. SpongeBob didn't know he was annoying. That was the comedy. In Choir Boys and episodes like it, SpongeBob's interference is active and knowing. He can see that Squidward is trying to get somewhere. He can see that his presence is unwanted. And he keeps going anyway. That's not innocent. That's not endearing. That's the behavior of someone who doesn't respect other people's boundaries. And the show's refusal to acknowledge this is what makes these episodes feel so off. I want to talk about something that I think gets overlooked in these conversations, which is the role of the animation itself in SpongeBob's decline. Starting around season 6, SpongeBob switched its animation production to Wacom Cintiq tablets, digital drawing screens that let animators work directly on computer. This was a practical decision that made the animation process faster and allowed for easier corrections. But it also changed the visual feel of the show in ways that are hard to quantify, but easy to sense. The early seasons of SpongeBob had a hand-drawn warmth to them. The lines had weight. The movements had squash and stretch. That the characters felt physically present in their environment. There were textures and details that came from the imperfections of hand-drawn animation, the slight wobble of a line, the way characters' proportions would shift slightly between frames. These imperfections were part of SpongeBob's charm. They made the world feel alive and handcrafted. The digital animation of the Dark Age, while technically smoother, lost a lot of that warmth. Characters moved in ways that felt stiffer. The colors looked flatter. The close-up gags, those trademark SpongeBob moments, where the show zooms in on a grotesque detail, became more detailed and realistic in the digital format, which actually made them worse. When SpongeBob zoomed in on something gross in Season 2, the hand-drawn style kept it cartoony, kept it at a remove. When the Splinter zooms in on SpongeBob's infected thumb in Season 6, the digital detail makes it genuinely unpleasant to look at. The technology that was supposed to make production easier actually removed one of the show's natural safeguards against going too far visually. The show would eventually return to hand-drawn animation in Season 9B, coinciding with Hillenburg's return as executive producer, and the visual difference is immediately noticeable. The characters feel like themselves again. The world has warmth. It's one of those changes that most viewers probably don't consciously register, but it contributes to that hard-to-define sense that something is different about the later seasons, for better and worse. Okay, I want to go back to specific episodes, because there are a few more I think deserve attention. And I want to be careful here about not just listing bad episodes. I want each one we talk about to illuminate something different about the show's decline. The storyboard for Boating Buddies was released years after it aired, and when you see what they originally planned, it changes your perspective on how these episodes got made. The original concept was reportedly even more aggressive in SpongeBob's stalking of Squidward, which means that what we got, which is already uncomfortably obsessive, was the toned-down version. That tells you something about the creative environment during this period. The instinct was to push further, and the filtering process that should have pulled things back was barely functioning. I want to talk about Nickelodeon's episode count decisions, because I think they had a cascading effect that most fans don't fully appreciate. After Season 5, the order went from 20 half-hour episodes per season to 26. That meant 52 individual segments instead of 40 per season. But the production schedule didn't necessarily extend proportionally. You're asking the same writer's room to produce more content with essentially the same resources. And when you do that, the weakest ideas that would have been cut in a 20-episode season now make it to air in a 26-episode season. Those extra 6 half hours, 12 segments, are where a lot of the worst episodes live. They're the ideas that would have been left on the cutting room floor if the show had a stricter quota. I can't prove this, obviously. I don't have access to the writer's room decisions. But when you look at which episodes from Seasons 6 and 7 are universally reviled, many of them have the quality of ideas that should have been killed in development. The Splinter, an episode about a splinter getting infected, doesn't feel like a story that someone was passionate about telling. It feels like a concept that got greenlit because the room needed to fill a slot. Choir Boys doesn't feel like a story anyone thought was particularly clever. It feels like SpongeBob Annoys Squidward, stretched to fill 11 minutes because they needed another Squidward episode. And here's the thing, the writers weren't bad at their jobs. The same people who wrote Dark Age clunkers also wrote genuinely good episodes. Casey Alexander, who co-wrote One Course Meal, also co-wrote Sandcastles in the Sand, which is one of the best Season 6 episodes. Zeus Curvis worked on both terrible episodes and decent ones. The inconsistency wasn't a talent problem, it was a volume problem. When you're producing 52 segments a season, you can't put your best work into every single one. Some of them are going to be filler, and in SpongeBob's case, the filler was often genuinely offensive. I realize I've been quite critical tonight, and I want to balance that with something I think is important to say. The people who made SpongeBob during the Dark Age, the writers, animators, voice actors, directors, were professionals doing their jobs under difficult creative conditions. They were working on a show whose creator had left, whose commercial expectations were enormous, and whose audience had impossible standards because the early seasons were so good. That's an incredibly hard position to be in. And while I've been tough on specific episodes, I want to be clear that I'm criticizing the work, not the people. Tom Kenny, Bill Fagerbakke, Roger Bumpass, Clancy Brown, Carolyn Lawrence, Mr. Lawrence, these voice actors gave everything they had to these characters for over 25 years. Even in the worst episodes, their performances are committed. Bumpass's Squidward is still recognizably Squidward in Choir Boys, even if the writing doesn't serve the character. Clancy Brown's Mr. Krabs is still magnetic in One Course Meal, even if the script asks him to do things the character shouldn't do. The voice cast is one of the greatest in animation history, and they deserve credit for holding the show together through periods when the writing couldn't support them, and the later seasons proved that the creative team was capable of excellence. The transition from Season 9A to Season 9B, which coincided with Hillenburg's return, is one of the most dramatic quality improvements in animated television. Episodes like Lost in Bikini Bottom and Pull Up a Barrel showed that the show could still find new stories to tell with these characters. The Dark Age wasn't the destination, it was a detour. Let me take a moment to talk about the voice actors, because I think they're the unsung heroes of this whole story, and I mean that sincerely. When you watch the worst episodes of SpongeBob, the performances are never the problem. That Tom Kenny has been voicing SpongeBob since 1999. That's over 25 years of being a talking sponge. And even in the most unwatchable episodes, his commitment never wavers. Listen to his performance in SpongeBob You're Fired. The crying sequence that goes on way too long, that's not Kenny's fault. He's doing what the script asks, and he's doing it with total commitment. The problem is the script, not the performance. And Roger Bumpass as Squidward, I think he might be the single most underappreciated voice performance in animation. Squidward is the hardest character in the show to play, because he has to walk this incredibly narrow line between sympathetic and pathetic, between arrogant and vulnerable, between someone you root for and someone whose comeuppance you enjoy. Bumpass walks that line flawlessly, episode after episode, for over 2 decades. Even in Choir Boys, where the writing reduces Squidward to a screaming victim, Bumpass's vocal performance gives the character more dignity than the script deserves. He mentioned in an interview with Animation World Network that Ink Lemonade was the hardest episode he ever worked on. The screaming sequences physically wrecked his voice for weeks afterward. That's dedication to a show that, in that particular episode, wasn't giving him much to work with. Clancy Brown, as Mr. Krabs, brings a warmth and a grandfatherly charm to the character that exists entirely in the performance, not in the writing. In One Course Meal, the script asks Mr. Krabs to be a sociopath, but Brown's voice still has that rumbling affection, that pirate uncle quality that makes you want to like Mr. Ye Krabs even when you shouldn't. It's like the voice is fighting the script, trying to remind you that this character isn't supposed to be a monster. Bill Fagerbakke as Patrick, criminally underrated. Patrick's stupidity is funny because of the specific way Fagerbakke delivers his lines. The confused pauses, the confident wrongness, the occasional flash of accidental wisdom. In Stuck in the Ringer, when Patrick delivers the forever glue line with absolute certainty that he's helping, the humor, such as it is, comes entirely from Fagerbakke's delivery. A lesser voice actor would make Patrick annoying. Fagerbakke makes him pitiable, which is harder and more interesting. Carolyn Lawrence as Sandy and Mr. Lawrence as Plankton round out a main cast that I genuinely believe is the strongest ensemble in animated television history. And the fact that this cast stayed committed through the Dark Age, through episodes that must have been painful to read at the table read, through scripts that reduced their beloved characters to torture victims and punching bags, speaks to a professionalism and a love for the show that the writing during that period often didn't deserve. There's a story, and I can't confirm this, so take it with a grain of salt, that at certain table reads during the Dark Age seasons, cast members would raise concerns about the direction of certain episodes, that the actors could feel that the characters weren't right, that the stories were going too far. Whether those concerns were heard or addressed, I can't say. But the fact that they might have been raised tells you something about the disconnect between the people closest to these characters and the institutional pressures that were shaping the show. I want to take a slight tangent here and talk about something that I find endlessly fascinating, which is the relationship between SpongeBob's worst episodes and its meme legacy. Because there's an irony so thick, you could cut it with a spatula. Some of the most iconic SpongeBob memes come directly from the worst episodes. The mocking SpongeBob meme, you know, the one where SpongeBob is doing the chicken walk with alternating capital letters, comes from Little Yellow Book, one of the worst episodes in the entire series. The scene is SpongeBob clucking like a chicken because he sees Mr. Krabs wearing plaid, and it became one of the most widely used memes on the internet by 2017. An episode that fans consider irredeemable produced an image that millions of people use to communicate sarcasm every single day. Confused Mr. Krabs, the meme where Mr. Krabs is spinning around in a blurry hallway, looking bewildered. That's from Nautical Novice, a season 6 episode. Not one of the worst episodes, but solidly in the Dark Age era. The Imagination SpongeBob Rainbow meme is from Idiot Box in season 3, a classic episode, but the tired SpongeBob, the caveman SpongeBob, the handsome Squidward, these memes were generated across the show's entire run, including the Dark Age. What this tells me is something counterintuitive, but important. Bad episodes can still produce great images, because memes don't need context. So they need a single expressive frame. And SpongeBob, even bad SpongeBob, is one of the most visually expressive shows ever made. The character designs are so clear, so emotionally readable, that a single screenshot can communicate feelings that entire sentences can't. You don't need to know that Little Yellow Book is a terrible episode to understand what mocking SpongeBob means. The image transcends its source material. And I think this is actually one of the reasons SpongeBob survived the Dark Age culturally. The memes kept the show in people's feeds, in their conversations, in their daily communication. Even people who stopped watching SpongeBob in 2008 because the quality dropped never actually stopped using SpongeBob. They just shifted from consuming the show as entertainment to consuming it as language. And that linguistic presence, SpongeBob as vocabulary, SpongeBob as emotional shorthand, kept the brand alive in a way that no amount of Nickelodeon marketing could have achieved on its own. It's almost like the show's cultural immune system kicked in during the Dark Age. The body of the show was sick, the writing was bad, the characters were broken, the stories were mean, but the mimetic DNA was so strong that it kept reproducing, kept spreading, kept evolving independent of the show's quality. SpongeBob the show was struggling. SpongeBob the cultural phenomenon was thriving. And that paradox, a show that gets worse while simultaneously becoming more culturally important, is one of the strangest and most interesting things about SpongeBob's history. I think about this a lot in the context of Steven Hillenburg's legacy. And he created something so visually iconic, so emotionally resonant at the level of individual images and expressions, that it survived everything that happened to it. The Dark Age couldn't kill SpongeBob because Hillenburg's original character designs were too strong. The faces he drew, the world he built, the visual language he established, those things are permanent. They can't be undone by bad scripts. They can't be cheapened by flanderization. They exist independent of any individual episode, good or bad. And in a way, that's the most Hillenburg thing I can imagine. The marine biologist who worried about SpongeBob dolls washing up on beaches as garbage also created a character so visually resilient that it literally became the visual language of the internet. Then the ecological anxiety and the cultural permanence, both are part of his legacy. He made something that will outlast all of us, including all the worst episodes we've talked about tonight. Which brings me, finally, to the end of our journey through SpongeBob's worst episodes. And I realize I've been talking about these episodes with a lot of intensity, a lot of emotion, a lot of analytical rigor. So let me step back for a second and ask myself, and you, a simple question. After all of this, do I still love SpongeBob? Yeah, I do. More than ever, actually. Because loving something means engaging with all of it. The best and the worst. The triumphs and the failures. The band geeks and the one-course meals. You can't love something honestly if you only acknowledge the good parts. That's not love. That's curation. Real love means looking at the worst episodes, understanding why they're bad, feeling the frustration and the disappointment and the occasional anger, and still coming back, still rewatching, still caring enough to make a video like this at what is probably an unreasonable length. SpongeBob SquarePants earned that love. The first 3 seasons earned it, the first movie earned it, and the later recovery earned it all over again. The Dark Age tested that love. But tests don't destroy love. They reveal its strength. And you know what? There's one more thing I want to talk about before I let you go. Because I've been focused on the episodes themselves, on the specific ways they fail, on the specific characters they betray, on the specific scenes that made me recoil. But I haven't talked enough about what these episodes do to the viewer. Not the analytical viewer, not the critic, but the kid sitting on the couch on a Saturday morning, eating cereal, watching SpongeBob SquarePants, because it's always been there, because it's always been safe, because it's always been a place where the world makes sense in a way that the real world sometimes doesn't. That kid doesn't know about flanderization. That kid doesn't know that Steven Hillenburg left and came back and left again forever. That kid doesn't know about Nickelodeon's commercial strategy or the shift to digital animation or the episode production numbers per season. That kid just knows that SpongeBob used to feel one way and now it feels another way. And that shift, that unnameable feeling that something you trusted has changed, is, I think, one of the most disorienting experiences of childhood. I remember, and this is getting personal, but I think it's relevant. I remember watching SpongeBob as a kid and feeling like the show understood something about me. Not in an obvious way, not in a "this character represents me" way, but in a way where the show's whole vibe, its warmth, its silliness, its willingness to be genuinely stupid and genuinely beautiful in the same 11 minutes, felt like permission. Permission to be enthusiastic about things. Permission to be weird. Permission to care about stuff even when other people thought it was dumb. SpongeBob's unashamed passion for his job, for his friends, for the simple act of existing, that was aspirational to me as a kid in a way I couldn't have articulated at the time. And when the show changed, when SpongeBob started being cruel to Gary, when Patrick started being mean to SpongeBob, when Mr. Krabs started being genuinely evil rather than comically cheap, that permission felt revoked. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, episode by episode, the show stopped feeling like a place where enthusiasm was celebrated and started feeling like a place where it was punished. SpongeBob's happiness in the Dark Age isn't infectious anymore. It's pathological. It's the kind of happiness that exists despite obvious suffering, which isn't inspiring. It's disturbing. And I think that's what fans mean when they say the Dark Age ruined SpongeBob. They don't mean it literally. They know the early seasons still exist, that they can still be rewatched, that they're still perfect. What they mean is that the Dark Age contaminated the emotional space that SpongeBob occupied in their lives. It took something that was unconditionally good and made it conditional. It took something that was always safe and made it sometimes unsafe. And once that trust is broken, once you've seen SpongeBob at his worst, you can never fully return to the innocence of watching him at his best. That might sound melodramatic. It might sound like I'm attributing too much emotional weight to a children's cartoon. And maybe I am. But I think the fact that SpongeBob's worst episodes can provoke this kind of response, the fact that they're not just boring or forgettable, but genuinely upsetting to people who grew up with the show, is itself proof of how powerful the original vision was. You don't grieve the decline of something you don't love. You don't spend 2 hours analyzing the failures of something that doesn't matter to you. The intensity of the fan community's response to the Dark Age is directly proportional to the intensity of their attachment to the Golden Age. And that attachment is Steven Hillenburg's greatest achievement. He made a show that people cared about so deeply that its failures felt personal. That's incredibly rare. That's the kind of cultural impact that most creators can only dream of. And while I'm sure the Dark Age isn't the legacy he wanted, the passion it provoked, the arguments, the analysis, the deeply felt opinions about specific 11-minute episodes of a cartoon about a sea sponge, that passion is entirely his legacy. He built the thing people loved. The Dark Age is just the proof of how much they loved it. Okay. I think I've said everything I need to say, and I want to be honest with you. I'm tired. This was a lot. I rewatched episodes that I would genuinely recommend skipping. I spent time with creative decisions that I think were mistakes, and I tried, as best I could, to understand why those mistakes were made and what they mean for a show I care about. But I want to leave you with one more thought, not an analysis, not a criticism, just an observation. There's this moment at the end of the first SpongeBob movie, the 2004 film that was supposed to be the series finale. SpongeBob and Patrick have been through the ringer. They've been captured, dried out, turned into merchandise, left for dead. And then SpongeBob plays a guitar shaped like himself and made of his own dried out body, and he sings Goofy Goober Rock. And the power of that song literally resurrects him and Patrick and saves Bikini Bottom. It's completely absurd. It makes no logical sense. But emotionally, it's devastating because it's the purest expression of what SpongeBob has always been about. The idea that joy, dumb, unironic, unapologetic joy, has power. That being yourself, fully and without reservation, is enough to save the world. That the Goofy Goober is the hero. The Dark Age forgot that. The worst episodes replaced joy with cruelty, enthusiasm with mania, self-expression with suffering. They forgot that SpongeBob works because he's happy, not because he's tortured. They forgot that Bikini Bottom works because it's a place where weird things happen to weird people who all fundamentally care about each other, not a place where characters are ground down for entertainment. But the show remembered eventually. It came back to that fundamental truth. And as long as it keeps remembering, as long as someone on that production team understands that SpongeBob SquarePants is, at its core, about the transformative power of being enthusiastically, ridiculously alive, the show will survive anything, even its own worst episodes, even one-course meal. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight, and I'm being serious. I don't have an answer, and I've been turning it over in my head for weeks. What does it mean that a show this good could produce episodes this bad and still be this good? Because that's the paradox at the heart of SpongeBob's worst episodes. They're terrible. I've spent the last couple of hours explaining exactly how and why they're terrible, but they exist within a body of work that is, taken as a whole, one of the most remarkable achievements in animated television. The same franchise that gave us one-course meal also gave us Band Geeks. The same characters who were tortured and flanderized in Season 7 were brought back to life in Season 9B. The same show that seemed creatively dead in 2010 is still generating new content in 2026. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if it means the bad episodes don't matter, because they do. They hurt people, and they sent terrible messages to young viewers, and they damaged the show's reputation. And I don't know if it means the good episodes are somehow diminished by their proximity to the bad ones, because they're not. Band Geeks is still perfect whether Choir Boys exists or not. What I think it means, and this is the closest thing to an answer I've been able to find, is that SpongeBob SquarePants is a living thing. Not a fixed object, not a closed system, but a living, evolving, imperfect thing that's been shaped by hundreds of creative hands over more than 2 decades. And living things have good days and bad days. They get sick and they recover. They make mistakes and they learn from them. They're not defined by their worst moments, but they're not defined by their best moments either. They're defined by the whole messy, contradictory, frustrating, beautiful trajectory of their existence. SpongeBob's worst episodes are part of that trajectory. They're the bad days. And the show's recovery, the return to quality, the late career excellence, the ongoing cultural relevance. Those are the proof that bad days don't last forever. And honestly, I don't know. I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I still don't know whether it would have been better for SpongeBob to end in 2004, or to continue and give us both the disasters and the triumphs. Both paths have their appeal. Both paths have their cost. And the fact that I can't choose between them, the fact that the question remains genuinely open after everything we've discussed tonight, tells me that SpongeBob SquarePants is more complicated, more interesting, and more worthy of serious attention than most people give it credit for. But I think Steven Hillenburg, who created a character whose entire philosophy is that bad things don't define you, would appreciate the irony. And he made a show about radical optimism, about the stubborn, irrational, beautiful insistence that the world is good even when all evidence suggests otherwise. And the show's own history has become an argument for that philosophy. SpongeBob went through a dark age and came out the other side. The world tried to break his show, and it survived. If that's not the most SpongeBob thing that's ever happened, I don't know what is. And if you're watching this at 2 in the morning and you can't decide whether to rewatch the Golden Age or give the later seasons a chance, do both. Start with Band Geeks, and remember why you fell in love with this weird little sponge in the first place. Then watch Plankton's Pet from Season 9, and see that the love survived the dark. And if you accidentally stumble onto one-course meal in between, well, just remember what we talked about tonight. Remember that it's the low point, not the end point. Remember that the show got better. Remember that somewhere underneath all those bad creative decisions, there's a marine biology teacher from Anaheim who just wanted to make people laugh. I think about Hillenburg's pitch meeting a lot. The Hawaiian shirt, the underwater terrarium with the little character models, the music playing in the background. A guy who loved the ocean and loved cartoons, sitting in a room at Nickelodeon, trying to convince executives to let him make a show about a sponge who lives in a pineapple. And they said yes. They said yes. And that yes changed television forever. Everything else, the dark age, the recovery, the memes, the movies, the $16 billion in merchandise, then the over 330 episodes, the cultural phenomenon, the worst episodes we spent tonight dissecting, all of it flows from that one moment. One man in a Hawaiian shirt saying, I want to make something about joy. And he did. And it survived everything. A very long, very painful detour, but a detour nonetheless. And before I move on to the bigger picture, there are a few more episodes I want to touch on, because each one reveals a different shade of failure that I think matters for the full picture. House Fancy, Season 6, Episode 1. A. Aired March 3rd, 2008. Literally the season premiere of The Dark Age. And here's the complicated thing about House Fancy. It's actually not a bad episode. It's one of the better episodes of Season 6. Squidward sees his rival Squilliam Fancyson's house featured on a TV show about fancy homes, gets jealous, and enlists SpongeBob to help redecorate his own house. SpongeBob causes chaos, but through accidental destruction, creates something the show's host considers a masterpiece. Squidward wins. Squilliam loses. It's one of the rare Dark Age episodes where Squidward gets a genuine victory, which makes it a bright spot in a bleak season. But nobody remembers any of that. What everybody remembers is the toenail scene. SpongeBob is moving a couch and accidentally drops it on Squidward's foot, ripping his toenail off in a close-up that is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, one of the most viscerally unpleasant things ever shown on a children's cartoon. The scene lasts only a few seconds, but it's so graphic, so detailed in its depiction of the toenail being slowly peeled away from the skin, that it overwhelms everything else in the episode. People who love this episode still can't defend that scene. People who've never seen the rest of the episode know the toenail scene. And here's the detail that makes it even more interesting. According to writer Danny McKaylee on Twitter, the scene was inspired by a real incident. He said he was helping his boss move a couch in the office, and the result was similar toenail removal. So the most infamous scene in Dark Age SpongeBob was based on something that actually happened to someone on the production team. They took their own real-world trauma and put it in a kid's show. I don't know if that's admirable commitment to authenticity or deeply concerning, but it tells you something about the creative headspace during this era. House Fancy is a perfect example of what I'd call a contamination episode. An episode that would be perfectly fine, maybe even good, if it didn't contain one scene so aggressively unpleasant that it poisons the entire viewing experience. The toenail scene has nothing to do with the story. You could cut it entirely, and the episode would work better. It exists purely for shock value, and the shock it delivers is so extreme that it's become the defining image of Season 6 for many fans. Yours, mine, and mine. Season 7. Patrick at his most hypocritical. SpongeBob buys a Krabby Kitty meal that comes with a little toy called a Patty Pal. He offers to share it with Patrick, because that's what SpongeBob does. He shares. But Patrick refuses to give it back. For the entire episode, Patrick monopolizes the toy, hiding it, running from SpongeBob, refusing to let him have even one turn. And when SpongeBob finally confronts him about it, Patrick eats the toy so nobody can have it. Mr. Krabs, seeing a business opportunity, makes 2 new Patty Pals so they can each have one. And then Patrick takes SpongeBob's wallet to pay for both of them. And when SpongeBob protests, Patrick says, and this is the actual closing line of the episode, "Have you learned nothing about sharing?" The hypocrisy is so extreme that it feels like it must be intentional satire, but it's not. The episode doesn't frame Patrick's final line as ironic. It frames it as a punchline. The joke is that Patrick is oblivious. But the problem is that Patrick's obliviousness here isn't funny. It's infuriating. Because SpongeBob was the one who shared. SpongeBob was the generous one. And the episode ends with SpongeBob being punished for his generosity, while the person who refused to share gets rewarded and gets the last word. The message, if there is one, is don't bother sharing, because people will take advantage of you. Which is, for a children's show, just stunningly cynical. And it's another example of Dark Age SpongeBob inverting the values of the classic show. Classic SpongeBob believed in kindness, in generosity, in the idea that being good to people was its own reward. Dark Age SpongeBob shows you that kindness gets exploited, generosity gets punished, and the selfish person wins. I actually have a theory about why the Dark Age writers kept making Patrick the villain in these scenarios, and it connects to what I said earlier about Patrick being the easiest character to write badly. But I think there's another layer to it. Patrick is SpongeBob's best friend. Their friendship is the emotional core of the show, and in the early seasons, that friendship was beautiful. 2 weird, enthusiastic idiots who genuinely loved each other and had adventures together. By making Patrick selfish and cruel in the Dark Age, the writers weren't just flanderizing one character. They were undermining the show's most important relationship. And when the central relationship of a show stops working, nothing else can compensate. You can have great jokes, interesting plots, beautiful animation, but if SpongeBob and Patrick don't feel like friends, the whole thing rings hollow. Let me also quickly address the scent of money. Season 7. Mr. Krabs discovers that Gary's shell acts as a magnet for loose change, and he proceeds to drag Gary around Bikini Bottom, using him as a living metal detector to collect every stray coin. Gary is clearly in distress. He's being dragged against his will. Mr. Krabs doesn't care. He keeps going until Gary is physically exhausted and covered in so much metal that he's barely recognizable. This episode is notable less for any individual scene, and more for what it represents about Mr. Krabs' character trajectory. In Season 1, Mr. Krabs was cheap. In Season 3, he was greedy. By Season 7, he's abusive. He's willing to exploit an innocent animal for spare change. Not for profit, not for business. For coins he finds on the ground. The escalation is almost mathematical. Each season, his greed requires more extreme expression, done because the writers have already used up the lower level greed scenarios. And at a certain point, you cross the line from funny cheapskate to someone who would literally sell another person's pet for pocket money. And once you cross that line, you can't really go back. This is the fundamental problem with Flanderization as a creative strategy. It's a one-way ratchet. Each episode has to push the character's defining trait a little further to feel fresh, to generate the same reaction that milder versions use to generate. But eventually, you push so far that the character stops being recognizable. And instead of laughing at Mr. Krabs' cheapness, you're cringing at his cruelty. And there's no way to walk it back without it feeling like a regression. The Dark Age wrote the characters into corners that the later seasons had to spend years climbing out of. I want to pause here and address something that I think some of you might be thinking. Why does this matter? It's a cartoon about a sponge. Why are you spending 2 hours analyzing it like it's Hamlet? And honestly, that's a fair question, but I think the answer is embedded in the question itself. The fact that people care this much, that I care this much, that you care this much if you're still watching, is precisely why it matters. SpongeBob SquarePants isn't just a cartoon. It's the cartoon that shaped how an entire generation processes humor, friendship, work, disappointment, and joy. The memes alone prove that. SpongeBob isn't just entertainment, it's a shared language. When you post a mocking SpongeBob meme, or a surprised Patrick, or a tired SpongeBob, you're using this show to communicate emotional states that words can't quite capture. SpongeBob has become part of how we talk to each other. And when something has that kind of cultural power, when it's literally embedded in the way millions of people communicate, its failures matter just as much as its successes. Because the messages it sends, even in its worst episodes, reach the same audience that loves it for its best. A kid who watches Band Geeks and learns that perseverance and teamwork can create something beautiful is the same kid who might watch Stuck in the Ringer and learn that standing up for yourself gets you publicly humiliated. Both messages land. Both stick. And the fact that one is beautiful and one is toxic doesn't mean the toxic one disappears just because you pretend it doesn't exist. There's another layer to the SpongeBob cultural impact that I want to touch on, because it connects directly to the worst episodes in a way most people don't realize. Remember the Super Bowl halftime show controversy? February 2019, the NFL had basically promised, or at least heavily teased, that SpongeBob would be featured in the halftime show, specifically Sweet Victory from Band Geeks. Over 1 million people had signed a petition for it. The football-watching world was expecting SpongeBob. And then, what we actually got was a brief SpongeBob clip that served as nothing more than a transition into a sicko mode performance by Travis Scott. The internet erupted. People felt betrayed. It was one of the biggest pop culture disappointments of the year. And here's the connection. That controversy only happened because SpongeBob had remained culturally relevant through the Dark Age. The petition was driven by millennials and Gen Z viewers who grew up with SpongeBob, many of whom had stopped watching during the Dark Age, but never stopped loving the show. Their attachment was to the Golden Age, to Band Geeks specifically. But SpongeBob's continued presence on the air, its continued presence in meme culture, kept that attachment alive in a way that a canceled show couldn't have. The Dark Age was terrible television, but it was also a bridge. It kept SpongeBob on the cultural radar during the years when the millennial audience was growing up and developing the nostalgia that would eventually fuel a Super Bowl petition signed by over 1 million people. It's a strange paradox. The same corporate decision that produced the worst episodes, Nickelodeon's refusal to end the show when Hillenburg wanted to, also produced the conditions for SpongeBob's continued cultural relevance. Without the Dark Age, SpongeBob would have ended in 2004. It would have been a perfect, closed, 3-season run with a movie capper. And by 2019, it might have been a pleasant memory rather than a living cultural force. The Super Bowl petition wouldn't have happened because nobody would have felt entitled to demand SpongeBob at the Super Bowl. You demand things from ongoing institutions, not from completed works of art. So Nickelodeon's greed, and I do think greed is the right word for continuing a show against its creators' wishes, produced something it never intended. By refusing to let SpongeBob die, they accidentally ensured its immortality. The Dark Age is the price of SpongeBob's permanence. And whether that price was worth paying is, ultimately, the question I keep coming back to. I also want to briefly address the spin-offs, because they're relevant to this conversation in a way that often gets overlooked. Camp Corral, SpongeBob's Underyears premiered on Paramount Plus on March 4th, 2021. The Patrick Star Show premiered on Nickelodeon on July 9th, 2021. Both were controversial among fans. Hillenburg had reportedly been against spin-offs during his lifetime, and creating them after his passing felt, to many fans, like a betrayal of his wishes. There was also the Saving Bikini Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie on Netflix in August 2024, and Plankton, the movie in March 2025. These spin-offs represent the same dynamic we've been discussing all night, just in a different form. Nickelodeon sees SpongeBob as a franchise that needs to expand. Fans see SpongeBob as a specific show with a specific vision that needs to be protected. And the tension between those two perspectives has defined SpongeBob's post-Hillenburg era just as surely as it defined the Dark Age. The spin-offs aren't bad in the same way that One Course Meal is bad. They're different shows with different creative teams and different mandates. But they exist in the same uncomfortable space. The space between what SpongeBob is and what Nickelodeon wants SpongeBob to be. And I think that's enough context. I think you have the full picture now. The specific episodes, the broader patterns, the institutional dynamics, the cultural ramifications, and the deeply personal reasons why all of this matters to people who grew up with SpongeBob SquarePants. This is why I think studying SpongeBob's worst episodes isn't just navel-gazing for nostalgic millennials. It's a genuine exercise in media literacy. Understanding how a show this good can produce episodes this bad teaches you something about how creative institutions work, how commercial pressures distort artistic vision, how characters can be degraded by people who don't understand them, and how even the most beloved things in our culture are vulnerable to neglect and exploitation. And look, I don't want to leave you feeling depressed about this. I really don't. Because the story of SpongeBob's worst episodes isn't just a story of decline. It's a story of resilience. The show got bad, and then it got better. The characters were flanderized, and then they were restored. The creative vision was abandoned, and then it was reclaimed. And that arc, from excellence to decline to recovery, is actually more inspiring than a show that's just excellent all the time. Because it proves that quality isn't an accident. It's a choice. It's the result of specific people making specific decisions to care about what they're making. And when those people stop caring, or when they're prevented from caring by commercial pressure, you get the Dark Age. And when they start caring again, you get the Renaissance. Hillenburg's return in January 2015 is the proof. And he came back to a show that many people had given up on, and he started making it work again. Not by reinventing it, not by trying to recapture the exact magic of 1999, but by reconnecting with the fundamental truth at the heart of SpongeBob SquarePants, that it's a show about a character who believes the world is good, made by a person who believed the same thing. That belief is what separates band geeks from choir boys. It's what separates pizza delivery from a pal for Gary. It's the thread that runs through everything SpongeBob gets right, and that's conspicuously absent from everything it gets wrong. And when Hillenburg passed away on November 26, 2018, that thread didn't break, because by then, he'd woven it back into the fabric of the show strongly enough that the people who continued after him could hold on to it. The SpongeBob of 2025 and 2026 isn't Hillenburg's SpongeBob in the way that the 1999 version was, but it's recognizably connected to it. The DNA survived. And as long as that DNA survives, as long as someone on that production team understands that SpongeBob is fundamentally about joy, about finding beauty in the mundane, about being unapologetically, almost naively enthusiastic about life, the show will be okay, even when it stumbles, even when it produces the occasional dud, because the foundation is still there, underneath everything. I want to come back to the Nickelodeon of it all one more time, because I think there's a broader lesson here that applies beyond SpongeBob. Every creative work exists in tension between artistic vision and commercial reality. And the best work happens when those two forces are in alignment, when what the artist wants to make is also what the market wants to consume. The first 3 seasons of SpongeBob were that perfect alignment. Hillenburg wanted to make something funny and weird and true, and the audience wanted exactly that, and Nickelodeon was happy because it was profitable. The Dark Age happened when those forces diverged. Nickelodeon wanted more content than the creative team could sustain. The audience wanted quality, but Nickelodeon wanted quantity. The writers wanted to tell good stories, but the production schedule demanded volume. And in that gap between what everyone wanted and what was actually possible, the worst episodes were born. This same dynamic plays out everywhere in entertainment. It's why the later seasons of The Simpsons feel different from the early ones. It's why sequels so rarely match their predecessors. It's why franchise filmmaking often produces diminishing returns. The commercial imperative to repeat success is fundamentally at odds with the creative imperative to take risks and tell new stories. And when the commercial imperative wins, as it almost always does, the result is content that exists to exist rather than content that exists because someone had something to say. SpongeBob's worst episodes are the purest expression of that dynamic. They exist because Nickelodeon needed to fill a time slot, not because anyone had a burning desire to tell a story about SpongeBob's thumb getting infected, or about Mr. Krabs driving Plankton toward ending his own life, or about Patrick torturing Gary while pet sitting. Those stories were generated by a production pipeline that needed raw material, and the pipeline wasn't selective enough about what it accepted. But, and here's where I want to leave you with something other than cynicism, the fact that the show recovered matters. It matters a lot, because it proves that commercial pressure doesn't have to be the final word. When Hillenburg came back, when the creative team recommitted to quality, when the animation went back to hand-drawn, the show got better. Not perfect, not as good as the first 3 seasons, but substantially, meaningfully better. The commercial pressure didn't go away. Nickelodeon still wanted content. The merchandise machine still needed fuel. But within those constraints, then the creative team found a way to make something worthwhile again. And that, I think, is the real story of SpongeBob's worst episodes. Not that they prove the show is broken, but that they prove the show can survive being broken. And there's something weirdly hopeful about that. Something very SpongeBob about it, actually. SpongeBob SquarePants, the character, is defined by his ability to remain optimistic in the face of everything Bikini Bottom throws at him. Squidward's contempt, Mr. Krabs' exploitation, Patrick's incompetence, the general chaos of underwater life. None of it can put a permanent dent in SpongeBob's fundamental belief that the world is good and life is worth living. The show itself has that same quality. 25 years of production, 16 seasons, dark ages, and renaissances, and everything in between. And SpongeBob SquarePants is still here, still making new episodes, still making people laugh, still inspiring arguments about whether One Course Meal or A Pal for Gary is truly the worst episode ever made. And the answer, by the way, is One Course Meal. It's One Course Meal, and it's not even close. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight, and I'm being serious. I don't have an answer, and I've been turning it over in my head for weeks. What does it mean that a show this good could produce episodes this bad and still be this good? Because that's the paradox at the heart of SpongeBob's worst episodes. They're terrible. I've spent the last couple of hours explaining exactly how and why they're terrible, but they exist within a body of work that is, taken as a whole, though one of the most remarkable achievements in animated television. The same franchise that gave us One Course Meal also gave us Band Geeks. The same characters who were tortured and flanderized in Season 7 were brought back to life in Season 9B. The same show that seemed creatively dead in 2010 is still generating new content in 2026. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if it means the bad episodes don't matter, because they do. They hurt people, and they sent terrible messages to young viewers, and they damaged the show's reputation. And I don't know if it means the good episodes are somehow diminished by their proximity to the bad ones, because they're not. Band Geeks is still perfect whether Choir Boys exists or not. What I think it means, and this is the closest thing to an answer I've been able to find, is that SpongeBob SquarePants is a living thing, not a fixed object, not a closed system, but a living, evolving, imperfect thing that's been shaped by hundreds of creative hands over more than 2 decades. And living things have good days and bad days. They get sick and they recover. They make mistakes and they learn from them. They're not defined by their worst moments, but they're not defined by their best moments either. They're defined by the whole messy, contradictory, frustrating, beautiful trajectory of their existence. SpongeBob's worst episodes are part of that trajectory. They're the bad days, and the show's recovery, the return to quality, the late career excellence, the ongoing cultural relevance. Those are the proof that bad days don't last forever. And honestly, I don't know. I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I still don't know. But I think Steven Hillenburg, who created a character whose entire philosophy is that bad things don't define you, would appreciate the irony. Thank you for watching tonight. If this video helped you fall asleep, I'll take that as a compliment. And if it kept you awake, well, that's what the next one is for. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep doing this. I'll see you in the next one. And if you can't sleep, just remember, the inner machinations of my mind are an enigma. Good night.